As its name implies, the MacroBuilder builds macros. So what is a macro? In MakerPlot, a macro is a text file with an extension of SPM, which contains MakerPlot instructions for configuring MakerPlot, creating and configuring controls, processing data, and pretty much any task supported by MakerPlot. Macros are text files with an SPM extension, as we've said. Macros may contain specific routines to be run. Macros contain MakerPlot code for configuring and processing. A startup macro may be assigned to run automatically each time MakerPlot is opened. Macros may call or run other macros, just like subroutines, and this is an important point. Macros may pass data for specific use in a routine. Macros may contain comments for code explanation. And macros may be written manually in Notepad or built from the current interface configuration in MakerPlot using the MacroBuilder that we see here. Now, if you're into programming, you can probably tell that macros are much like microcontroller code, except we use our own MakerPlot set of instructions to create the objects like switches, meters, text boxes, and so forth. So before we get into the MacroBuilder itself, we first ought to know what a macro is and how it's structured by MakerPlot to make interfaces like this one. So let's take a block diagram look at the macro for this, which is our My interface. As you can see, it consists of three primary labels. The init portion defines the fixed parameters of the interface, like set default macro, new plot, title, call objects, which we'll get into a second, name, form, and another call, and then finally ending with the end mac. The init section, as we've just pointed out, calls two other macros that act like subroutines, the objects and the DCONST. And just like a subroutine call, the objects macro loads all the buttons, switches, and labels and so forth, and then returns to the init routine. The DCONST is a small macro that simply puts up the MakerPlot logo at the top of the plot area. The important thing to understand, though, is that each one of these separate macros begins with a label followed by a colon, and it ends with the ENDMAC designation. Now that tells MakerPlot to return to the calling routine or to stop processing instructions if it's the default macro like the init routine is. And again, more on this very soon. There are significant differences in how the macro is actually built, so let's get into that right now. First, let's take a look at the structure of the MacroBuilder itself. Now, the Initialize section shows the code that is run to initialize the macro and configure the plot, with comments optionally added. Now, you can scroll through and see the code required to perform the various operations to configure MakerPlot, such as scales, file names, and so forth. And let's do that here. We'll just scroll through this. We're going to go through and get a much better look at it in a few minutes. But anyway, this is what the Initialize section is all about. Two instructions of note are worth discussing here. And that is, first, the !macr.objects. As we've shown, this informs MakerPlot to load and run the objects section of the defined macro, and it's kind of like calling the subroutine. The other instruction of note is the DEFM (ME close paren) instruction, and this sets the init part of the macro to the default macro. So that says I'm defining myself, which is the name of init, as a default macro. That means I can go ahead and I can call macr.objects, and here at the very end I can call the other subroutine, which is DCONST. So that's the general structure of our initialize part of the macro, and we'll get into more of this as we go forth. Let's go down to the other parts of the controls. The button update from current rebuilds the initialization section with any changes or options used. The test code button takes the initialize code and places it in the processing queue to test it, excluding any subroutine calls, to make sure everything configures the way you would expect it to, and you can make manual changes to the code and test it. One point to note, if you make manual changes, updating or rebuilding may change your manual changes unless you test first and MakerPlot locks in those settings. Okay, let's look at the other checkboxes. The generate comments code places comments at each of the instructions or blocks of code. Then we come to the start new plot on initialization. This adds code to initialize a new plot when run, and that's the exclamation NEWP instruction. Save data values. If you use exclamation point SETD, which is set data instruction to store data, selecting this option will add code to the section to reload those values. If you label data values using like exclamation point LBLD, code is always saved for labels. Save user menu. If you've redefined the user menu / pop-up selections through the configuration window, this allows saving them to the file. The Save Object Editor Custom Colors checkbox. If you've defined custom colors for use in code, this saves the colors to the macro. Then comes the Save Port Configuration to macro. This saves the COM port information such as the port number, baud rate, and other line settings defined by the port instruction. Now, if you don't know the exact port number a user will have, the use of this checkbox is really not recommended, and we don't really recommend checking any of the boxes that you don't see shown here, because these are all sort of customized settings, and once you get into MakerPlot and understand more about how macros are built, then you can choose to either check them or not check them. And finally, the connect and plot on initializations. Now this adds code to automatically connect and plot when the macro finishes building the interface. Now note that no code should go after the instructions of the connect, because once the queue is empty of all information, that will be it. The upper right text box, the code header, is code that is not processed but can contain authoring and revision information for the file. For example, this one still says standard MakerPlot interface, and Selmaware Solutions is the authoring authority for this. So that's about it for the init routine. Let's go to the objects. And here we really get into all the code that has to do with the buttons, switches, text boxes, labels, and so forth. As we, go right through it, you can see that it's, quite a bit there. Let's just kind of try and describe it here. And once again, we're going to go into a couple of examples that'll give you a much better idea of what it does in a few minutes. The code to resize the plot, handle the background images or colors, and create the controls and configure the object is generated here. As you look at this section, you can see the code to create a control, configure it, and add update values and event code for it. We should also point out that you should consult the controls object summary for detailed information on coding objects by hand, or for any of the information that's pertinent to MakerPlot. It's all in our documentation section on our website. User-defined section. In this section, you can write your own macro routines to be called and run. We don't have any examples of this. However, our written documentation does, so please refer to that. Then we have our constant drawing sections. Here's one. This section shows any constant drawing that may have been used with your plot. This allows constant drawings to carry forward into the build, such as placing a name on your plot, or other things like this one. It clears the area and it puts up our MakerPlot logo, which is right here on top So that is what the constant drawing does. Then we come to the menu button section. If Save User menu is selected in the Initialization section, that's up here, which we did not check Save User menu. Had we checked Save User menu, the menu buttons would have been populated with code to configure the user menu pop-up code. Now let's take a look at a particular object, and let's compare that against what we built in our object editor. Let's pick an object out of our object editor and compare it against how the MacroBuilder actually builds this. Let's pick our reset axis, and let's come down here and find our reset axis. Here it is. Here is our reset axis. All right, let's compare line by line what's going on. So in our object editor, what we did was we just basically filled in the blanks. We filled in the coordinates. MakerPlot gave us the name of the button, which is BUT-RESET axis. We see that that's the name of our comment. It goes on to say plot object MP_IMGBUT object dot button reset axis equal 15.5, 10.2, and if we look, that is our left and top coordinates. Then it goes on to say 7 and 4, and those are our width and height. Then I'm going to spread this out a bit, then it actually goes on to say what particular images we're going to look at. And for example, we picked the image button of the PB-SW green _0 GIF for the off button and the green _1 GIF for the on button. We chose it as a momentary switch, and we set it to a 1, which means we want to actually execute it. Then there's a font size. The font size was extracted from our object editor, font size of 6, and there it is. Color, here's the font color. Once again, it's FFFFF. Here's our sound. There's our text tip. Text tip is down here. Set access to current user settings. The event code is one of the most important things to allow us to have the button execute whatever event code we want it to do. And as you'll see, the event code is exactly the same as the event code we have entered in our object editor. So as you can see, the first part of the button is the build in terms of its physical structure, and the next part is the event code that actually makes it do whatever we say it should do. And following that, we have our labels points. That's our label. And if we look here on our object editor, that's the next one in line. We can take a look at it. And once again, we can see how it's constructed. So you can go and do this on your own, and it will describe to you exactly how MakerPlot transfers the information from the object editor to the MacroBuilder. And this is how macros are built. And we can look at macros in another way. Come up here to our macro menu, and we can see that we can edit macros with MacroBuilder. That's what we've done. And we can also edit macros with Notepad. So let's click on it. Click on My Interface. And here's our macro in Notepad. We can see that the entire macro is there in a continuous format, starting with the init section. Then it goes on to the object section, and this defines all the controls in the order that they were entered. You can look at these individually and see how they're constructed. For example, down here at the button reset axis, we can see that the button reset is formed by these POBJ instructions, and then it executes the event code when the button is depressed. The objects portion of the macro is really there to define all the various buttons and switches and text boxes and so forth. And they just sit there and wait for a click usually to execute. And that's what the objects portion of the macros do. And finally, way down here at the end, now we see the small macro that defines the MakerPlot logo that we have up here at the top of our plot area. To finalize what the MacroBuilder does, let's click on it again and bring it up. And once we're done creating our macro, the next thing to do is to click on the toolbar icon here inside the macro pull-down menu. What this does is it brings in the latest changes, if any, that we've done to our macro. It brings it all into the MacroBuilder, where we can then come in and save the macro to the macro file that we've chosen. And then we can come to the stoplight icon, click it. Let's just do that. And we're going to rebuild our macro based on what we put in it just up to now. We want to use our object editor, that's this one, to build our interface. And then we want to use the macro builder to take whatever we've actually built and compile it, if you will, into a form that MakerPlot understands in terms of creating all the controls and how they should operate. All of this and more is available in written form on our documentation section, and you'll be able to find the documentation that you want for not only the object editor and macro builder, but for just about everything that we have in the MakerPlot repertoire.